The FBI arrested him this morning after he told senior employees yesterday that his business was a giant Ponzi scheme.
Tonight, as much as $50 billion is gone, vanished.
Also developing now at noon, another round of arrests in the Bernie Madoff scam, and this time his longtime secretary, who lives in Boca Raton, is now in federal custody.
When it comes to the late Ponzi schemer Bernie Madoff, you could truly write a book.
Imagine having only $5,000 left and then magically turning that $5,000 into $64 billion overnight. Sounds incredible, right?
The real question is this: was all this legal? Absolutely fucking not.
And if it was, why should a son call 911 on his own father to have him arrested? It's shocking, isn't it? But let's dive back into the story. This is the story about Bernie Madoff, a famous former stockbroker who ran his multi-billion-dollar firm as a grand-scale Ponzi scheme. But how did his story begin? Bernard Lawrence Madoff was born on April 29, 1938, in Queens, New York, to a very poor family. Slowly, they managed to cope with their poverty and became financially stable when Bernie's parents got into finance. However, from early on, people had suspicions that something was fishy about their financial dealings. In the 1960s, Bernie's mother was registered as a broker-dealer, listing the Madoff's home address in Queens as the office for a company called Gibraltar Securities. Authorities eventually forced the closure of this business because they failed to provide a report on its financial condition. On top of that, their house had over $13,000 in unpaid taxes from 1956 until 1965, and several individuals claimed that the company and the loans were all a front for Bernie's father's underhand dealings. But no one knew the truth.
He was denied that at the time. He was in jail for 11 felony charges, money laundering, false statements. At the time, those who chose to invest with him had over $60 billion with him. Now, of that money, all of it, not all of it was recovered. $13 billion was received, but $17.5 billion was not recovered. And so to your point, there were literally thousands who were definitely out of money. What he would do is he would attract a new client offering wonderful returns, too good to be true, took the money, deposited it in his own bank account, and then later paid returns from earlier investors. This can go on and on and on until you're not attracting enough new people, and a lot of people maybe want to get paid or they want to take their money out.
Following in his parents' footsteps, Bernie showed some interest in finance as he got older, mainly to impress his girlfriend, Ruth Alpern. He also had a passion for swimming. When he wasn't competing, his swim coach hired him as a lifeguard at the Silver Point Beach Club in Atlantic Beach, Long Island. This job earned him his first $5,000, which would eventually grow into $64 billion. Now, here comes the start of his financial career. After graduating from Hofstra University in Long Island, Bernie first tied the knot with the love of his life, Ruth, in 1959. He earned his bachelor's degree in political science from Hofstra in 1960 and then enrolled at Brooklyn Law School. However, he didn't stick with law school for long. Instead, he decided to use the $5,000 he'd saved from his lifeguarding job and a side gig installing sprinkler systems, along with an additional $50,000 borrowed from his in-laws. With his capital, he and Ruth founded an investment firm called Bernard L. Madoff Investment Securities, LLC. And with the help of Ruth's father, who was a retired certified public accountant, the investment business attracted numerous investors through his connections. They gathered an impressive roster of clients, including famous celebrities such as Steven Spielberg, Kevin Bacon, and Kyra Sedgwick. However, Ruth's father's influence wasn't the only reason for their rapid growth. The firm's reputation for reliable annual returns of 10% or more also played a significant role. By the end of the 1980s, the Madoff firm was handling more than 5% of the trading volume on the New York Stock Exchange, which Bernie considered a huge victory and achievement. Slowly and gradually, their firm became so prestigious that only select individuals were allowed to invest, fitting specific criteria. As the firm continued to grow, investigators later suggested that Madoff's pyramid or Ponzi scheme originated in the early 1980s. But the question you might all be asking is, how were they actually making money if it was really a Ponzi scheme or a fraud? In reality, all the money he received from his investors was deposited into his bank account. When his old investors asked for their returns, he would pay them using money from recent investors. This cycle continued for years, perpetuating the scheme.
According to the Manhattan District Attorney, Bongiorno helped assist Bernie Madoff in perpetrating the largest financial fraud in history. They say she assisted Madoff for decades in ripping off hundreds of millions of investor dollars.
In 2001, Barron's Financial Magazine published an article that cast doubt on Madoff's integrity. Financial analyst Harry Markopoulos repeatedly presented the SEC with evidence, including a detailed investigation titled "The World's Largest Hedge Fund is a Fraud." Despite this, no action was taken against Bernie by the SEC because other large accounting firms such as PricewaterhouseCoopers, KPMG, and BDO Seidman reported no signs of irregularities in their financial reviews. Additionally, JP Morgan Chase's bank ignored possible signs of money laundering activities in Madoff's multi-billion-dollar Chase bank account.
And he also talked a lot about how, the banks on Wall Street were complicit in his fraud. He said they knew what was going on, and he could have got caught any time. He said if the regulators had done their job, he would have been caught.
But it all came crashing down for Bernie in a short span of time. The longevity of his firm was largely due to feeder funds. The money Bernie's firm received from investors was transferred directly into these feeder funds to generate returns. However, during economic crises, the money Bernie's firm had transferred into these funds became problematic. Investors had no idea where the money was going or how they would receive the promised 10% interest by the end of the year. When Madoff's operations collapsed in December 2008 amidst the global economic crisis, he reportedly admitted the extent of the scam to his family. The feeder funds collapsed, and losses were reported by international banks such as Banco Santander of Spain, BNP Paribas in France, and Britain's HSBC. These banks had issued huge loans to investors who were now wiped out and unable to repay the debt. Bernie was also exposed when he informed his sons that he planned to give out several $1 million in bonuses earlier than scheduled. They demanded to know where the money was coming from. Without any shame, Madoff admitted that a branch of his firm was actually an elaborate Ponzi scheme. This revelation led Bernie's sons to call the police, ultimately bringing an end to his fraudulent operations.
Also, they say that prosecutors are charging Bongiorno with fabricating investor deals and other charges that could land her behind bars for a maximum of 75 years. Prosecutors say year after year, Annette Bongiorno and Joanne Krupe protected and perpetrated the Madoff mirage while putting very real money in their own pockets.
Bernie didn't shy away from the shame. He outright confessed to the investors that he had lost between $50 billion and $60 billion. On March 12, 2009, he pleaded guilty to 11 felony counts: securities fraud, investment advisor fraud, mail fraud, wire fraud, 3 counts of money laundering, false statements, perjury, false filings with the SEC, and theft from an employee benefit plan. Prosecutors stated that $170 billion had moved through Madoff's principal account over decades, and before his arrest, the firm's statements showed a total of $65 billion in accounts. On June 29, 2009, U.S. District Court Judge Denny Chin sentenced Bernie to 150 years in prison, the maximum possible sentence for the 71-year-old defender, and he was sent to Butner Federal Correctional Complex in North Carolina to serve his sentence, while efforts began to return investors money through the sale of his assets.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Katie Couric here in New York, where Bernard Madoff has just been sentenced for the biggest investment fraud in Wall Street history. A federal judge ordered Madoff, who is 71 years old, to serve a maximum 150 years in prison. Now, that is what prosecutors had asked for. Meanwhile, Madoff's lawyer said 12 years was more appropriate.
But unfortunately, while being imprisoned, Bernie faced personal tragedies as his son Mark committed suicide in December 2010, and his other son Andrew lost his life to cancer in September 2014. And surprisingly, earlier in 2014, it was reported that Bernie had suffered a heart attack and was diagnosed with stage 4 kidney disease. 81-year-old Bernie later died on April 14, 2021, to a normal death at the Federal Medical Center in Butner, North Carolina.
The story of Wall Street swindler Bernie Madoff took a grim and tragic turn this weekend. Police found his older son, Mark, dead in his New York apartment on Saturday. Police said Mark Madoff committed suicide by hanging himself on the 2-year anniversary of his father's arrest, while his own 2-year-old son was in the next room. Brian Ross joins us now with much more on this story. This really is Shakespearean.
It really is, Elizabeth. Mark Madoff's suicide, by the way, will not stop the legal proceedings against him, according to lawyers in the case.
4 years after his death in February 2018, Bernie's rise and fall was brought to screens in Madoff, a 2-part miniseries starring Richard Dreyfuss as Bernie Madoff and Blythe Danner as his wife, Ruth. Just 2 months after the series aired in April 2018, the Justice Department announced an additional $504 million would be distributed to Madoff victims, bringing the total restitution to $1.2 billion. The government aimed to eventually return approximately $4 billion to his clients, although this was only a fraction of the estimated $80 billion that the disgraced investor had lost.
Bernie Madoff essentially now saying he's got nobody. He's all alone.
That's right. He said he has 300 minutes to speak on the telephone, on the payphone, but he has no one to talk to. Nobody in his immediate family talks to him. His wife refuses to talk to him. His remaining living son won't talk to him. His brother Peter Madoff, who was sentenced to 10 years in prison in South Carolina, he won't talk to him. And the only people that visit him are his wife's niece's daughters. I think it's called grandnieces. And they go to a college nearby, but he said he really doesn't have anyone to talk to.
And with that, we conclude today's story. Do you think his sons did the right thing by calling the police on him, or were they possibly trying to avoid being implicated in any wrongdoing themselves? If you enjoyed this video and want to watch more fascinating topics like this, click on the video that's popping up on your screen. Until then, take care and goodbye.